I had a whole other topic planned for this week, but then Trump said this thing, and the media spent the next several days showing us that they've learned nothing, not just from 4 years of covering Trump previously, but from history, American history. You don't have to be a historian or know lots of details. Even just very broad strokes would guide the media through this coverage if they stopped and learned a little bit and thought things through. As Trump made these remarks, literally in less than a minute of him saying it, I started hearing from listeners. And as I started looking into the coverage, I discovered that the media was just straight up missing so much of what it should be saying. The job of news agencies is to get you the truth, and truth equals facts plus context. Today, how Trump's remarks about Gaza sparked media confusion and made people panic, and why we really need to look back, starting with, yes, really, the U.S. Civil War and World War I and World War II. Plus, in preparing this episode for you, I came across an archival video from the U.S. government that is so striking for what it says today. I watched some parts of it repeatedly because it's amazing, or sadly, actually not amazing, how much of it rings true right now. Is all that cryptic enough for you? Don't worry, I will explain it and set the media straight. Today, on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Levs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news and looks at systemic problems in the news ecosystem that prevent the media from doing the job of getting you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. At least that should be the job of the media, not just witnesses in court. I know we've been having new people join us lately, so welcome. It's great to have you here. For those of you who don't know, I spent 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR and 10 on CNN, where I became lead on-air fact checker. And throughout all that time, I saw so many of these problems. Now that I'm on the outside, I'm able to address them head on. And the more people find out about this show, the more the media will change. So as you're listening, I encourage you to share the show. Be sure to subscribe, all those good things. With each episode, I send out a newsletter, usually more than one, and it's packed with links and facts and information. I don't expect you to take my word for anything. And I love to hear from you. There are two ways to reach me. One way is that some people are supporting this show by becoming paid subscribers to the newsletter. They then get special content and some other perks. You can find all that at my website, joshlevs.com. Just click newsletter. The other way is for any listener. There is a form that you can fill out at my site. As I mentioned at the top, it was only a matter of seconds before I started to hear about this. Trump made these remarks about Gaza, and then the media went haywire, as you probably saw. Here's just one example of the kind of reports that have been everywhere. This one's from NBC.
With his global megaphone,
the U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip.
President Trump's provocative and volatile vision of an American takeover of war-torn Gaza is roiling the world tonight.
The Riviera of the Middle East.
Here's something that the syndicated program Inside Edition put out. This is actually a good one to look at. It's owned by CBS, and it has a lot of viewers, millions of viewers, actually.
He's serious. The Trump White House is doubling down today on the president's audacious plan to take over the devastated Gaza Strip and turn it into a world-class tourist destination.
By the next day, his team was already walking it back and trying to reinterpret and saying, well, he always starts out with these big pronouncements as a negotiation tactic, etc. The media absolutely should report on the fact that Trump says this stuff. He is the president. This is what America voted for. And the media should standardly point out that Trump regularly says he's going to do things and then doesn't. Trump saying something doesn't make it a plan. That should basically be a caveat for all of his quote-unquote sudden policy announcements that people don't see coming. Remember, he never built that wall and made Mexico pay for it. Just days ago, the tariffs he was threatening fell through. So let's just get this out of the way. Context for anything like this is that Trump does this kind of thing. So maybe don't report in a panicked way and remind people that that is his MO. Even though his mentions of apparently relocating Gazans and then bringing them back to live in this imaginary utopia type place, all that is disturbing for him to say. And absolutely call him out on it with context. But there's a lot more that the media missed. This is where we get into something that I actually covered in the first episode of They Stand Corrected. And that is the whole idea of occupation. because the coverage of this story shows what the media has been getting wrong for so long. I won't rehash it here, but I explained in the first episode the craziness of the media all these years, referring to Gaza and the West Bank as the occupied territories. I explained that there are lots of occupied territories around the world and that Gaza and the West Bank don't fit that description by just about any traditional definition. Israel left Gaza about 20 years ago, and as for the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority itself put in writing, in documents that it gave to the United Nations about Jericho a couple years ago, that the Israeli occupation period ended in 1994. I know that sounds confusing, and something I've been explaining lately in some of the speeches I'm doing is that that kind of confusion is a good thing. That is the moment in which you realize that the media has been misleading you forever. Here is how it plays out now. If the media really believed that all this time Gaza has been quote-unquote occupied, what they would be saying now is, Trump's suggestion is that it go from being occupied by Israel to being occupied by America. But no one's saying that, because that's not the position that Gaza has been in all these years. The taking over part is what made dozens, hundreds of headlines, actually, saying Trump wants to take over Gaza. Well, if it was already occupied, overtaken by Israel all these years, why wouldn't the media be saying that? They're not, because it hasn't been. And it gets worse. Lots of people in the media have said all along that this has really been an American occupation of Gaza, or America backing an Israeli occupation with America as some kind of puppet for Israel, or vice versa. There are tons of examples like this. Here was a professor, his name is Rashid Khalidi, and he is, of course, from Columbia University. He was speaking on the BBC just a few days after the October 7th massacres by Hamas in Israel.
The United States government is the sponsor of this occupation.
Another professor, Cornel West, is a darling of the U.S. media. He's all over in the media. He says stuff like this, too. He called the evil atrocities committed by Hamas a violent resistance to oppression as an act of desperation, which is insane. Hamas took off and gained control of Gaza after Israel left. He said this group on October 7th was acting against U.S.-supported occupation. So, if this is what people believe, then why wouldn't people be saying, well, so what he's suggesting is it go from the U.S. backing Israel's occupation to the U.S. doing it itself, or something like that. No one is saying that. No one's asking about this because it wouldn't be. A time like this is when you stop and you tell people facts. They're paying attention to the story. Why not use it to educate them on some basics? Well, first, news agencies would have to learn basics themselves. Meanwhile, the media has been freaking out about Senator John Fetterman, a Democrat from Pennsylvania. There were tons of headlines about him because he did not just straight up reject and attack Trump's remarks. I replied about this on X, actually. Looking at his quote, I pointed out that he stated facts. He said, quote, "The Palestinians have refused, or they've been unwilling to, deliver a government that provided security and economic development for themselves. They allowed 10/7 to occur, and now Gaza has to be rebuilt." There's nothing false in there. A bunch of headlines said that Fetterman said he would, quote, fully support, unquote, U.S. troops on the ground. That's what the biggest paper in his home state, the Philadelphia Inquirer, said in a headline. And as you might know from this show, way more people see headlines than actual news stories. So that is what a lot of people will believe. But Fetterman's actual remarks were more complex and require context. This was based on an interview with something called Jewish Insider. Here's what they wrote. Asked if he wanted to see U.S. troops on the ground, Fetterman replied, "I don't know what the role of U.S. forces is, but they're obviously a part of it, and I fully support." So what their role would be, he doesn't know. And what he meant by it isn't clear. For the record, in terms of the effort in the Middle East and fighting back against Iran and its proxies that include Hamas, the U.S. is already a part of it. We have troops in the region. U.S. troops have come under attack from Iran proxies and been killed by Iran proxies. What exactly he meant, we don't know. Anyway, I've watched Fetterman in interviews, and what he actually said is more stuff like this. I found some unedited remarks that ABC posted online.
I didn't really saw that as like a super serious kind of a situation, and it's really just trying to shake things up and just announce like there is some truths about Gaza.
So there's the immediate things that the media has been ignoring. But now it's time for the bigger picture. To understand this whole topic, we need to look at two wars most Americans still have moral clarity on: the U.S. Civil War and World War II. In fact, World War II ties in directly to today's reality in Gaza in ways that almost no one in the media understands.
This is an absolutely amazing podcast. Josh Levs is a treasure and a wonderful source of information.
I just wanted to thank you for They Stand Corrected. It's just fantastic. Thank you for these tools and for your incredible work here.
If you are not listening to They Stand Corrected weekly, then you are doing yourself a disservice. Never before has a podcast like this been so necessary. Josh, keep up the good work.
I absolutely love your podcast.
I love what you're doing to prevent the democracy demolition of 24/7 toxic disinformation.
It's a highlight of my week every time it comes out because I know I'm going to learn something. You have made me a much more educated consumer of news.
Thank you so much to everyone sending in messages like this. To find out how you can do the same, get in touch. There's a form that's free and available to anyone to fill out. It's linked in the show notes. War efforts don't end when a war ends. When one side has a hateful anti-democratic ideology that celebrates slaughtering civilians, that officially recognizes some people as being subhuman, and that side loses, the next step is post-war occupation. These days, when people hear that word occupation, they have been subjected to decades of propaganda about it, as I mentioned earlier. So let's set aside today's conflict, and let's instead look back. 2 wars in history most Americans have a sense of moral clarity about. Not everyone, but most. The Civil War and World War II. Let's start with the Civil War. Most Americans understand that it's good that the North won. There were lots of problems and complexities, and horrible things happened in war. It's also a fact that the South was fighting to continue slavery, and the North was fighting for a government that was officially ending slavery. Here's a historian and author, Robert Dunkerley, who has written about the Civil War. This is a piece of a talk he gave about what was happening at the end of the war.
As the summer unfolds and Union forces will occupy the South and all the fighting gradually dies down, what you're going to have are former soldiers, former military leaders, former governors and government officials of the Confederacy, civilians, former slaves, and Union occupying forces, all facing a very uncertain future.
I'm guessing you don't know anyone who says it's an awful thing that the North occupied the South after the Civil War. Maybe you do, but that's not something you would hear often. I'm not saying it's the same thing as anything today. It's not. This is about learning from history. Post-war occupations are important. This podcast is not the place to go into all the specifics, but I'll just acknowledge many of the goals that the North had did not take off for the South, obviously. Let's jump up to World War II. When the Nazis were defeated, the occupation, including occupation of Germany, by the Allied forces, that included the United States, began. At the time, the U.S. government was saying how crucial it was that this occupation be complete.
After the last war, this small area of Germany was occupied. Today, every square inch is under the authority of Allied troops.
This is a film that the U.S. government had at the time about U.S. troops taking part in the post-war occupation of Germany.
We have come to Germany not as liberators, but as conquerors. And this time we shall remain for 10 years, for 20, if necessary, forever.
They used the example of one prototypical German guy, Carl Schmitt, and they show how he was raised in his society to believe horrific things.
For we shall not leave until Carl Schmitt has come to realize that he himself is responsible for not only the past, but the future. We have rid him of Hitler and the General Staff and Nazism.
Don't get ahead of me here. There isn't currently a world war in which the U.S. was attacked on its home soil. This is not support for what Trump said. This is about what a post-war occupation even is, what it can achieve. The media's failure to accurately portray Gaza and the ideologies that are widespread among Gazans, that failure is in danger of leading to a much bigger war in the future, not just in the Middle East. It could affect anyone. And this is not me being alarmist. This is just a look at history. Did you hear that first line I played for you from that film just now?
After the last war, this small area of Germany was occupied. Today, every square inch is under the authority of Allied troops.
The last war referred to there was World War I. There's been a lot of reporting about how the failure to take stronger action against Germany after World War I led to the rise of Nazism and the horrific Second World War. In that film, the U.S. government said not enough of Germany was occupied after World War I. And that was just one of the problems. So many German leaders who carried out atrocities were not punished. This is something that the famed TV journalist Walter Cronkite referred to. He did this audio for NPR.
The Allies remembered their bitter experience with Germany after World War I.
If we look into the laboratory of political science, we will see why our plan to punish the Germans at the end of the First World War failed.
That was the voice of Louis Neisser. In 1944, he was one of America's most famous attorneys.
When U.S. officials, or anyone worth hearing from, discuss what should happen with Gaza post-war, any legitimate conversation should include real discussions about what actions to take against the ideology that Gazans have been raised on. I've reported on this overwhelming support for the purposeful slaughter of civilians. There are numerous surveys carried out by Palestinian agencies. There won't be peace without taking on this ideology. Now, sometimes the media does acknowledge the ideology that is so common among so many Palestinians. Here was one clip from News Nation in early 2023.
Palestinians celebrating, cheering, big crowds, happy faces, fist pumping. Apparently they were giving out candy, setting off fireworks, lighting bonfires in the streets. This area of Gaza is under the control of Hamas. But what exactly are they cheering? Israeli police say a 21-year-old Palestinian walked up to a synagogue in Jerusalem, started shooting people on the street outside the building with a handgun as residents were observing the Jewish Sabbath. The gunman took off, was later killed in a shootout with police. The gunman's father praised his son, calling him a legend and a hero, according to the New York Times, saying he raised him well.
That segment is incredibly rare in mainstream news. As long as the media continue to bury their heads in the sand, the hate that is taught there will grow and spread and metastasize. Now, some people say, well, wait a second, there are hateful people in Israel too. Yes, there are. There are hateful people everywhere. Absolutely. And in liberal democracies like the United States and Israel and Western Europe and Australia, people have access to information. And there are structures ensuring that people of different backgrounds and beliefs have rights and participate in government. It's not the same. In totalitarian governments, that totalitarian messaging, this is the only way to be, these other people are subhuman, that stuff becomes gospel. Here is one video from MEMRI. It's an organization that tracks this stuff. They show a Hamas children's TV show in which there are these characters teaching them about the evils of Jews, and the group offers a translation here. It says, the boy then declared that the Palestinians will fight to their last drop of blood. And the man agreed and praised the martyrs. In April 2023, this group Memory had this Hamas official who's a sheikh in this televised sermon referring to Jews as brothers of apes and pigs and praying for the annihilation of polytheists and atheists and saying, oh Allah, enable us to get to the necks of the Jews. This ideology, this whole way of thinking has to be tackled in any next step for Gaza. History proves this. In ignoring it, the media is missing a centerpiece of the story and a centerpiece for where things are headed. There's also another element to this. There's a direct connection between the Islamist forces that control Gaza and Nazis. Here's an author, David Dallin. He's written about this. He gave a talk. He starts off here with a reference to Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem.
The alliance between Adolf Hitler and the Muslim fundamentalist world was actually initiated and forged by the Grand Mufti at the very beginning of the new Nazi regime. It was not until 1938 that Hajj Amin al-Husseini's overtures to Nazi Germany were officially reciprocated. But by then, the influence of Nazi ideology had already grown significantly throughout the Middle East, that is, throughout the Arab Middle East. Several of the Arab political parties founded during the 1930s were modeled after the Nazi Party. This is often forgotten by historians.
He goes into how Nazi materials, including Mein Kampf, were distributed widely and treated as fact throughout the Arab and Muslim world, and how later Palestinian leaders were trained on these ideologies.
As one scholar has noted, the Grand Mufti was a precursor of both the Palestine Liberation Organization and of the Palestine national struggle and movement. The terrorism, fanaticism, and ruthlessness of that movement reflect his enduring legacy and his enduring influence.
And here's a talk from Edwin Black, another author. He wrote a book called The Farhud, Roots of the Arab-Nazi Alliance in the Holocaust.
The Farhud is actually an iconic symbol for the Arab-Nazi alliance in the Holocaust. A group of people that were dwelling in a land for 2,600 years, the Jews of Mesopotamia, of Iraq, 1,000 years before Muhammad, came to be considered vermin, Untermenschen, which is German for subhuman. The alliance went into the battlefield. The Muslim forces of the Third Reich were not just independent militias, they were Waffen-SS units dispatched all over Europe.
Again, I'm not doing a history lesson here. The key is that the media needs to acknowledge reality. You cannot have any legitimate journalistic discussion about what happens in Gaza after this war without acknowledging the reality of Gaza today, and that includes the ideology that people have been raised on. It's necessary for the media to look back and learn about post-war occupations, including denazification of Germany, and the risks of failing to address these ideologies. As I was watching that old Department of Defense video, I was stunned by certain parts of it. That is coming up. I have an event coming up that you can attend live wherever you are because it's a webinar. This one is for a group based at the University of Colorado. It's called Health Links. And we're talking about the challenges and opportunities for caregivers in this new era. This is something I've discussed on the show. I follow this closely and have my own experience that led me to understand what works for caregivers and organizations and our whole society. This is for people who do any kind of caregiving. You might care for children or an elderly parent or a spouse or another loved one. It's taking place on February 19th during the day. There's a sign-up link that you can find in my newsletter, and added bonus, it includes continuing education credits. Now, for those of you who are in fields where you don't need any of these, this is going to sound like alphabet soup, but some of you do use these. You can get the following types of credits for this event: CHES, CIH, CPH, CSP, and SHRM. I know that sounded a little bit Sesame Street-ish, but these continuing education credits can be really important for people in certain fields, and no matter what field you're in, if this interests you, I would love to see you there. Just look for the link in the newsletter. Throughout the war that began when Hamas launched those massacres October 7th, 2023, surrounding Arab nations have refused to take in Gazans as refugees. And that has been the case for many, many years. That is largely because this population is so radicalized, and they bring their radicalization with them. As I've explained in previous episodes, Palestinians launched a bloody civil war in Jordan. They hijacked planes that had nothing to do with Israel. They attacked an embassy in Khartoum. They created a state within a state in southern Lebanon. Any productive conversation about Gaza after this war has to make de-radicalization a centerpiece, despite what all the screaming liars on U.S. college campuses are saying. They're radicalized too. They've been radicalized by lies pushed by Islamist groups with roots in Nazism. So, talk of post-war occupation and reconstruction has to include ideological efforts to educate people with facts and knowledge about humanity. There's so many examples that show how people in Gaza are taught lies. I mentioned recently, Hamas called the concept of teaching Palestinian kids what the Holocaust even was a war crime. Somehow, teaching kids a fact, in their view, could be called a war crime. And of course, their fans around the world would agree with that. When you're under an authoritarian government, you can't learn facts. But also, while denazification of Germany was largely successful, occupations can also bring hellish elements. That is part of the reality, too. A couple of years ago, Deutsche Welle did a documentary about rapes carried out by Allied troops against women in Germany during those years.
It was a nationwide catastrophe, one that affected an entire generation. I was a war trophy. That word conveyed all the horror.
It's horrific. And there also was a great friendship formed between Germany and the United States. Remember Kennedy's famous speech in 1963?
As a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
A recent piece in The Spectator by historian Katja Hoyer talked about the remarkable success of the Allied occupation of Germany. Allied nations kept a military presence in Germany well after the occupation, and she wrote about how in 1994, the last 200 British, American, and French soldiers withdrew from Berlin. British Prime Minister John Major gave this speech before these crowds in Berlin. He said, "We came as adversaries, we stayed as allies, and we leave as friends." The AP has sound from the celebrations that day. These were not like good riddance celebrations, they were supportive. Anytime the topic of Gaza post-war comes up, the media should advance discussions about a long-term strategy that ensures human rights and deradicalization, denazification. In that old film from the Department of Defense that I played you a clip from earlier, there are so many parts that are chilling to hear now if you are not blinded by lies in mainstream media. When you understand the death grip that Hamas has on Gaza, Hamas forcibly kicked out the other political party years ago. First, they were killing and kidnapping each other's members, and then Hamas took over, and Hamas slaughters, tortures, punishes anyone who dares speak out against it, which, by the way, is a part of the death toll that you keep hearing attributed to Israel. Throughout this time, Hamas has gotten away with killing all kinds of people and blaming Israel. And Hamas controls everything, including the quote-unquote Ministry of Health that keeps putting out these alleged death tolls and stuff. When you know all that, when you understand that, you can't help but hear some parallels in this old film.
The German press became a Nazi press. The German airwaves open only to Nazi voices. Nazi papers, Nazi books, Nazi pamphlets. These were all the people could read. Nazi speeches, Nazi dramas, Nazi music. These were all the people could hear. Hitler working his people into a frenzy. In my schools, a youth will grow up before which the world will shrink back. There must be no tenderness in youth. Brutality is respected. I shall spread terror. Today, Germany. Tomorrow, the world. After the last war, the same state officials remained in office. Today, any Nazi is forever barred from having authority.
I'll post a link to it in the newsletter so you can check it out. As always, I would love to hear from you. There are two great ways to get in touch with me. The best way is to become a paid subscriber to the newsletter. I give you extra content, including how to access all kinds of news articles with no paywall, legally for free. And it's only paid subscribers who can message me directly through the newsletter and post in comments. The things that you say there are generally the biggest force in determining what I talk about on this show. Other people can reach me through a form on my website, joshlebs.com. I'll send your thoughts, your questions, anything I got wrong. I would love to do segments called I Stand Corrected. I look forward to hearing from you, and I will see you next week. Before you go, one quick idea. Think of someone you know who might be particularly interested in this episode. Click the share button and send this episode to that person saying, I really think you should listen to this episode. In this era in which people are so overwhelmed with content from the moment they get up to the moment they go to sleep, getting a note from someone they know saying, I think you specifically would find this interesting, that is often the most impactful thing to help people discover this show. Thank you.